Have you ever had one of those classic 90s games that's just stupidly hard? Where the mechanics are unexplained and come at you like a truck? Where the difficulty is so monumentously high that you'd unfairly get a game over for blinking too quickly? Everyone's had a video game they've been stumped by in their lifetime, maybe forever, until one day you beat it and it's not really satisfying to have done so. For me, that game was Sonic the Hedgehog 2 for the SEGA Master System and Game Gear. Predating the more well-known title on the Sega Mega Drive by less than a month, or exactly 1 month in Japan, this platforming game has literally nothing to do with Sonic 2. It includes Tails in his first official debut, that's as clear as crystal, but really it's a sequel to Sonic 1 8-bit, and kind of exists in a bubble alongside the main series rather than be a main part of it, which you can say for the entire Game Gear lineup if we're being honest. It was crazy that this was developed alongside Sonic 2 and Sonic CD. Sega must have really wanted to strike gold 3 times simultaneously to catch up with Mario's success. So, what is Sonic 2 8-bit? Why is it so gut-wrenchingly hard, convoluted, and depressing at the same time? And what is it even about? Who is this guy? In this video, I'm gonna try my best to answer all of these. For unknown reasons, this game would see a change in developer companies from here onward for the Hedgehog's life on the Master System and Game Gear, for the most part. Gone was Ancient and their close-knit family, who would go on to publish other titles, most exclusively Streets of Rage 2 and 3, and in came Aspect. It's got a similar name, but is different in that it was run by company president Kazuyuki Ukiawa and founding member Hiroyuki Seigasa. Aspect Co. Limited, later called Aspect Digital Entertainment, would produce nearly every Sonic game on these two systems, and even a number of non-Sonic ones, like Legend of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse. Yeah, that's the full name. They would continue this train ride across multiple game consoles up until 2018 when the company fell due to bankruptcy. As it is. The crew behind Sonic 2 8-bit, which was developed at the same time as its Genesis counterpart, had very little contact with the combined team in the US, if at all, as artist Craig Stitt can attest to. They probably only borrowed art of Tails to use as a template for his sprites, or borrow the sprites to directly use in the game's level art if these are any indication. They look rather blatantly slapped together. Speaking of slapped together, the box art isn't too bad, although they are certainly not Watanabe or Martin's best. The Japanese box art is almost identical to the one for the Genesis, save for a couple more coloured shapes added. If I were to guess, it was reused because they were short on time or funds. The international box art is admittedly appealing from a distance. Sonic does look impressive, flying in a sky full of mechanical foes, but the closer you look at it, the more things start to feel off. Tails is showcased running alongside Sonic, even though he only appears at the beginning and end of the game. The Badnik designs vaguely resemble those in the game, but with some details exaggerated to make them look more scary. And Sonic looks fine, except for his eyes looking somewhat askew. It's probably from his pupils looking downward instead of up. It being the only part of the character not having been rotated with the rest of him really makes it stick out like a sore thumb. Yeah, not one of my favourites of Martin's covers. So, both the Master System and Game Gear versions were made simultaneously, with the former releasing on November 1992 in PAL regions, and the latter later coming out on the 21st of that same month in Japan. Other countries wouldn't get access to the Master System version until the re-release on the Wii Virtual Console. The Game Gear one would see much more publicity, being re-released as an unlockable minigame in Sonic Adventure DX Director's Cut in 2003. Sonic Gems Collection would have it as part of its more obscure game lineup in 2005. The Nintendo 3DS would have it on the Virtual Console in 2012 in Japan, internationally available a year later, and in Sonic Origins Plus in June 23rd, 2023, would add it to its game library. Upon the original release, Sonic 2 for the Master System was considered an improvement compared to Sonic 1, but was highly praised at the time for its challenging gameplay and even won an award for Best Portable Game of 1993. Fans and reviewers alike ate this shit up, the Game Gear alone being the best-selling game on the platform. Video game enthusiasts really enjoyed their difficulty back then. Let's get into the game itself and examine its contents. The game doesn't have that much of a story, and most of it is confined to the manuals, but it at least has more meat than the previous title on the system. Following Dr. Robotnik's defeat and the loss of his giant blimp, Sonic the Hedgehog goes out on his own to look for more adventures. When he returns to South Island, all of the animals have vanished, with a note left by his close friend Tails. Don't ask how he met him already. The panicked letter details that the animals were kidnapped, and the fox is being held prisoner in the Crystal Egg, which can only be reached if the 6 Chaos Emeralds are acquired. Opposing the Hedgehog's progress, along with the regular Badnik models, are 6 fearsome Master Robots, which make up most of the bosses of this game. Upon defeating the last of these, if all emeralds were collected, Sonic makes his way to the mysterious Crystal Egg, and frees Tails from his captor after a final boss battle. The bad ending has the blue boy running alone as the credits roll, the day slowly turning to nighttime before he stops to look up at the starry sky. There is a vision of Tails in the stars as the end text drops in, an image that's burned into many a fan's memory due to how it appears that the fox did not survive his captivity. I won't go too into it, but it sparked a lot of Tails is dead fan theories. I personally never saw it that way. It feels more like just him reminiscing on his friend in the easiest way the system can showcase a remorseful cutscene. In the good ending, where Tails is freed, he follows close by his hero Sonic, the same sorrowful music playing, and Sonic is up there with Tails in the stars, which now fully reflects the title screen of the game. Oh yeah, the gameplay. Let's take a look at that. By the by, if you enjoy this kind of stuff from me, don't be afraid to drop a like, comment, or hit subscribe. You'll feel good about it, I swear. Using a similar engine to Sonic 1 8-bit, it's the usual affair during the early years of the franchise. You run to the end of 3 acts of a zone, with you starting with 3 lives, and get extra ones from collecting 100 rings. Said rings are your only shield, so the Hedgehog doesn't die immediately from wayward hazards, because get this, there's no shield power-up in this game, because the developers felt it wasn't punishing enough. Sonic can use the spin jump to attack enemies, as well as the rolling spin attack, but not the spin dash like in the 16-bit version. Why it was not included is unknown. Either the team on this game could not, or completely ignored implementing it on a handheld system. The Hedgehog's moveset may be familiar, but the gameplay has a couple of little changes that you will discover shortly after booting the thing up. Loops are now functional for the first time in a handheld Sonic game, although they are quite rare, so it's more like a neat one-way roller coaster. You can't backtrack through the level when these things are around. Additionally, rings function the same as a collectible and allowing the blue boy to take a hit, but get this, they actually scatter around after you lose them, allowing you to collect one again. I'll take this over Sonic 1 8-bit's handling of it any day. Time overs are still a thing, although the levels are so short you'd have to actively try to run out of time to ever see that happen. There is one other thing that I'm surprised I hadn't brought up before, but hey, here's the sitch. Continues are a common feature in video games, mainly those close to the arcade era, where if you acquire it by some means, instead of being sent back to the title screen after a game over, you have the option to continue where you last left off, hence the name. In all of the Sonic games I covered so far, each have this feature and their own version of the screen. And the continue icon themselves appear after the tallying of your score, with a delightful jingle and a miniature version of a playable character popping in. In Sonic 1, continues are given to you when you collect 50 rings on the tricky special stages. In Sonic 1 8-bit, there are continue monitors that appear in special stages, which you can only keep if you get to the end before time runs out. Sonic 2 gives you one when you get at least 10,000 points by the end of an act, and in this game it is only if you find a Chaos Emerald or when a specific bonus panel reward is given. Monitors continue to be helpful, containing some familiar power-ups including 1-ups, super sneakers, 10 rings, and invincibility sparkles. The music that plays when you pop the magic dust open is about as panicked as I get when playing this sodding title. There is one single Sonic monitor placed in the final level, but its graphic is obscured by foreground objects, so I literally forgot about it until now. Springs once again launch you into the sky and across gaps, which is doubly tricky in these games due to how little bearing you have on your surroundings. This game really enjoys using them, and they are quite fun to use at times, except when they are combined with spikes or lava pits, which is every other time. There are no two types of spring colours that bounce you at different ranges of speed, they all function the same, though they do change colour to match the palette of their respective zones, which is an admittedly cool touch. Also, diagonal ones exist, meaning I was incorrect in saying that they were introduced in Sonic 2. Spikes. Spikes are the worst. I wouldn't say they are implemented well. The level designers placed them everywhere, from regular obstacles to being your punishment for taking a wrong turn, to long carpets of the stuff that you don't even have the chance to escape without losing a life. Its overwhelming usage is one of the things that can affect your enjoyability of this game. You know one thing that's missing that hasn't appeared in any of the footage? Yeah, where's the sodding checkpoints? A curious omission, considering how long some of these zones can get. If they were trying to artificially add difficulty, then they succeeded, but there must have been some other, more efficient ways to ramp up the difficulty gradually. Though it should be noted, in the game's files exists that same arrow symbol monitor which were the checkpoints in the last game. Sorry, I promise to get back on track. High-speed tubes, as later games would call them, appear in a couple of zones, and unlike in the 16-bit version, holding a button down in a direction lets you go down a connecting pipe when you reach it. These unfortunately are also very frustrating, whether it's because they are located underwater when you're in need of air bubbles, or when they are used in conjunction with beds of spikes. Air bubbles spawn underwater in Aqua Lake Zone, appearing once at set intervals in Act 1, and being scarcely scattered around the trap-laden maze in Act 2. There also exists big bubbles at certain sections, which are required to progress in underwater labyrinths. Standing in these send Sonic upward, with you being able to slide back and forth and also control the speed of which you rise. As long as you read the manual, it shouldn't be too confusing. Contact with any surface, be it spikes, enemies, or a wall, has the bubble disappear, requiring you to fall back and get a new one and potentially run into more trouble. Other new gimmicks introduced in this game are minecarts and hang gliders. Minecarts are rideable objects that carry Sonic down a set path, often into magma, but you can hop off at any time and gain a slight burst of speed. Hang gliders are a little bit too tricky to get a handle on, but they are used to cross high peaks in one of the zones. They require running at them at full speed, and then having to hold left and right to have it inch forward. Be mindful of your fingies. Holding down right, as you naturally do when playing a video game, has Sonic dive downward like a rock. Quite an annoying gimmick, and it's hecking everywhere. I don't want to play a crappier version of Flappy Bird Sonic 2. Bonus panels reappear and act how they did in the previous game, but more often than not it's just the Cthulhu-faced Eggman. Be afraid. In my previous 8-bit vid, I failed to mention how you get the different faces on the turnstile because it's not actually random. You get Robotnik every other time, 10 extra rings to your score if you lost 2 lives, a 1-up if you collected 15 rings or lost 3 lives, depending on the version, and the special stage if you collected 50 rings. In Sonic 2 8-bit, any face other than the big bad is very rare to get, as the stipulations are a little more obscure. The Sonic face still gives you a 1-up if you lost 2 lives, the ring gives you an extra 3 rings if your count is a multiple of 10, and a very elusive Tails one only appears if you have exactly 77 rings and did not lose a life. This one gives you a continue. With the omission of special stages entirely, Chaos Emeralds, like in Sonic 1 8-bit, are scattered around the maps. One appears in Act 2 of every zone, and they are very well hidden. Dare I say, a little too well hidden for how important they are to reach the final stage. You'll need a guide for most of these. And while we're on the subject of stages, let's take a look, as well as the music that accompanies them. The game's soundtrack was composed by 3 individuals this time around, them being Masafumi Ogata, Naofumi Hateya, and Tamanori Sawada. The latter 2 would be series mainstays for composer and sound designer roles, but special mention to Ogata for composing the Sonic CD track, You Can Do Anything, with its main leitmotif first being used in one of this game's levels. So let's check out the zones. They are certainly something to behold, both good and bad. The game starts out in Underground Zone, a very foreboding welcome and a subtle, unintentional hint to this game's unfriendly nature. A subterranean level located near the mountains, lava, fireballs and rail carts make for a fun, if rough, joyride as you navigate to the exit. There are spikes on the ceiling that can drop down on you, but rolling into a ball seems to render them harmless when they do so. The music here isn't much to write home about. It's frantic and it doesn't really carry much of a beat. Very mid-first stage overall. The boss here is Pitmaster. Level 2 is Sky High Zone, a mountainous area surrounded by dense clouds and beanstalks. The main features of this zone are hang gliders, which are the only way to progress, so you better learn how to use them, and clouds of which Sonic can walk on and spring off of sometimes. Act 2 takes place during a thunderstorm with a lot of updrafts, and the level theme is gratifying for how bouncy and spacey it sounds. I kinda like it. The boss here is Hiyoko Master. Aqua Lake Zone, an admittedly pretty level with pink fountains on the surface and treacherous labyrinthic tunnels under the water. Act 1 is easily skipped by having Sonic skim himself like a stone when rolling at max speed, which, fun fact, was actually a feature borrowed from the unused idea box for Sonic 1 for the Genesis. Act 2 is a winding maze with no source of air except for stray bubbles. Also a lot of tubes that tend to waste precious time rather than speed you to safety. The music for this zone, much like Sonic 1's Labyrinth Zone, is a very funky and long tune that gets your head bopping as you're trying to survive in these slow water sections. It's my favourite theme in the game, which made crawling around the tunnels worth it. The boss here is a performing seal called Balance Master. Green Hills Zone is next. Very unusual that. Not only is it the only level carried over from a previous game, but it's not the first level for a change. Why it's called Hills instead of just Hill like usual is unknown, but if I had to guess, it was probably a typographical error. Being the familiar tropical meadow, but with a few different assets and background features, there's not really much to note in the level design, unless you enjoy blind jumps over beds of spikes. The music is rather enjoyable to listen to, and it is the predecessor of the main theme of Sonic CD. Fought at the end of this zone is Dahayo Master. Why is this the fourth zone again? Gimmick Mountain Zone, a hollowed out mountain filled with machinery and conveyor belts. The flywheels here are rather tricky to use, requiring you to move in the direction of its rotation and then pressing up to rock it upward. And there's a lot of ramps here that require you to roll into a ball at high speeds, lest you fall and get hit by spikes. The music's a little repetitive and grating, but it fits the frantic, unsafe environment well. The boss at the end of this zone is Charge Master. Scrambled Egg Zone, Robotnik's hidden base situated in a rocky cavern. An ominous, twisting landscape with a foreboding, epic track to go along with it. Second favourite music track in the game, with it once again being attached to a beyond frustrating stage. High-speed tubes litter the place, also giving the level a sense of serious finality, and the boss fought at the end is Mecha Sonic. Having all the Chaos Emeralds grants you access to Crystal Egg Zone, probably the most unusual of Robotnik's bases in that it is almost entirely made of glass. Hazards are somehow more manageable compared to the previous zones, the only enemies are flying fish in the sky, and the spikes gleam in a rainbow of colours, along with the rings. The level theme is also strangely positive, and with a whimsical ring to it, it's more befitting of a special stage than the villain's final fortress. Act 3 takes place in a darker looking area, and is where the final boss is confronted, Robotnik in a room where he can electrocute you unless you hide in the tube system. Other notable themes in the game are the intro music, which plays in the cutscene before the title screen pops up, first game to have an intro cutscene before the title. It has a nice little jingle that sounds a little too happy about Tails being yoinked away to become a prisoner. There's a reason I used it for my intro music in my comic videos. The ending theme is a particularly noteworthy track. It's very bouncy, but with a hint of regret that fits well with what Sonic would probably be thinking on his solo trip, and also because of the whole missing Tails thing. Tails is dead! But enough about that. As short as this game is, I'll dedicate this next part to the handful of characters who appear in it. Much like other titles at the time, not just counting Sonic ones, the characters are all their typical affair. Our boy Sonic hasn't undergone any changes between the Master System entries, from the look of his sprites to the way he plays. Tails is sadly confined to a side character role in this game. The developer did not yet have the groundwork to base their sidekick character off of, so the game's title cards, and ending screens are the only times the little guy makes an appearance. Narratively it makes sense, but it is still unfortunate the debut of Sonic's Player 2 is given the same amount of screen presence as Princess Peach 7 years prior. The fox does have some unused files left in the game, where he cries before smiling towards Sonic. This reaction is much more natural. At least compared to Tails in the final product, where Tails' reaction is just a slow, duh, it's Sonic. Dr. Robotnik, or Eggman outside of the West, has much less of a presence in this game, the least amount of appearances in a Sonic title thus far due to his position as recurring boss being given to his mechanical forces. What little in-game screen time he occupies are the bare minimum, not as minuscule as Tails', but just enough to be remembered through the game's cutscenes. In Act 3 of Underground Zone, following Sonic nearly soaring into a lava-y death, the good doctor flies in to rescue him, which makes more sense as a transition to the boss battle rather than a motivation the villain himself has. As you'd think he'd rather let the Hedgehog die in Minecraft, so to speak. I personally see it as an accidental foreshadowing to his only I can kill you complex he develops way later. He is the one fought as the final boss in the unlockable last zone, and makes an additional appearance before Tails is rescued, where he exits stage left and isn't seen again until you reach the intro screen once more. I do like his angry little rage animation when you land a hit on him though. The little animals are technically in this game, but like with Sonic 1 8-bit, they aren't freed from badniks due to the limitations of the system. Their only appearance is at the end of every Act 3 of a zone, contained within capsules that look like Robotnik's moustached face. The Badniks, the villain's animal-based robots, continue to act as obstacles, even during this frustrating chapter in the Hedgehog's adventures. Their designs are once again more simple and limited in features, which is echoed in the game's artwork, with them looking more like coloured doodles from the game's early conception stages. Though one interesting addition to the series are the Master Robots, a select number of baddies that were built a cut above the rest in terms of power and durability. It's worth noting that this category of Eggman robots was an entirely Western naming convention, much like how Badnik was before being internationally accepted in the early 2010s. These souped-up tin cans, in an even more crude likeness to the wildlife they are based on, act as the game's bosses at the end of each zone, a trend that would follow in a majority of Sonic's 8-bit adventures. Strictly in this appearance, they all have Master in their name, as they consist of Pitmaster, a giant antlion that Eggman accidentally damages with his cannonballs, before annihilating it in presumably a fit of rage for losing to Sonic. Unless he was Leroy Jenkinsing at his nemesis, of course. We only see its head, but in the files exists more of its body that were hidden by the tiny screen size. The boss in the clouds is Hyoko Master, a long gooseneck that spits out fireballs and not much else, though in the game's files it would have presumably had a full body instead of just a head on a pole. A Balance Master is a seal robot with sunglasses which can inflate its nose and launch it like an explosive. It would counter Sonic by bouncing him in his ball form if you jump when it's not in its inflating animation. That's the only time I'm using Sonic and inflating in the same sentence. The Hyo Master is like a sumo pig, a real chunky unit with the ability to roll into a ball, either along the ground or in a horizontal line. Funny, that's the second Green Hill boss with a spinning ball incorporated into its battle tactics. Charge Master, half ball, half jittering motor. It collides into the wall in an attempt to ram you, which drops falling rocks, while also making it open to be struck with a spin attack. Mecha Sonic, in his first canonical appearance, is rather unorthodox, a hedgehog robot, possessing rockets for arms, a red visor, which is blue in the game's artwork, and can release a claw from its chest to attack. When it rolls into a ball, it will bounce Sonic away if it is struck, and it zooms across the little arena at dizzying speeds. Like with Mecha Sonic from the second Genesis game, he was initially named Silver Sonic by fans for convenience, and also because it was his actual original name in the instruction booklet. The concept of the Master Robots, side note, also reminds me of a classification of robots from comic material, from Sonic the Comic to Archie Sonic's run. There, bigger ones were called Super Badniks, a rank attributed to those large in scale. At present, the name has only been mentioned in Sonic Frontiers, no doubt having been snuck in there by the writer of the comic, you cheeky bugger you. Although Tails does pronounce it as a Super Badnik, so it's more like a compliment sounding. Who told the voice actor to say it like that? Anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, let's take a look at the Badniks. Terrabins are a variant of the crabmeat Badnik, which act in the exact same manner, the only difference being their coloration. Probably the most common enemy you'll see in the game. New Mortadora, translated as New Motobug, are a version of that Badnik with a blue body and yellow head. They are different in that they stop for a moment before coming into contact with the Hedgehog. Neutrons return and fade in and out of their scenery before attacking, be it from their position on a wall or in the frickin' clouds. Games are turtle badniks which have the ability to turn into floating spiky shells of doom. Regardless, they can still be defeated with a bop on the noggin, and are more of a threat when positioned on small ledges. Mecha Hiyoko is the name given to the baby bird badniks only seen during the ad phase of the goose head on a stick boss. They are notable for being extra dangerous because you don't have any rings to save you from dying from touching a baby. Zarinrin is a crayfish type which only appears underwater. Despite being robots, they look and act like typical territorial creatures and only approach you if you're close to them. Orobots reappear, this time wearing sunglasses. What is it with this game and giving the robots shades? They act much like they did in Sonic 1 8-bit and appear to dig through solid metal floors. Bombs have a slightly altered design, but are otherwise the same, exploding into projectiles after their fuses light up. They can be pretty annoying in platforming segments due to how quickly they reappear on the screen due to its small size. Butans are literally just hopping pigs. They don't launch bouncy balls like the ball hogs, but the bright spot on their belly does make it look like they're holding one. And lastly, flying choppers, badniks which seem to nonchalantly swim in the air, which really adds to the zone's bizarre, dreamy feel. Very weird. I suppose it's high time I talk about the more recognised version of Sonic 2 8-bit, and that's the version that got ported the most. Game Gear time. Yay. The Master System and Game Gear versions of this title were developed in roughly the same time frame, so are there any issues ironed out to make the Game Gear port a more optimised experience? No. The biggest difference is evidently the screen resolution, making the Hedgehog's journey even more harrowing. Unlike the case with Sonic 1 8-bit, where the character sprites were scaled down to compensate for the smaller field of view, this version does not have that luxury. A bigger sprite means a bigger target, and the fact obstacles can literally come at you because you happen to be running fast in that particular moment has happened more than once in many a playthrough. Also not helping is the sodding camera, because the developers thought the best way to counterbalance the screen being smaller was to have the camera move to slightly in front of where Sonic is facing, presumably to allow the player to see the road ahead. A decent idea in theory, but this is a platforming game. You jump around on platforms and move around left and right. As such, the camera will jitter back and forth when all you really want to do is position yourself on uneven terrain. Absolutely wild that they included this feature instead of doing what the previous company did. The lack of seeing what's ahead gets even worse when you take in pits of spikes and springs, making every bound into the sky a leap of faith lest you die and have to start from the beginning. And the tubes, my word, the tubes. If they were confusing enough already, try not even being able to see where Sonic is going until a split second when it enters your view. It makes the later parts of the game needlessly punishing. The boss battles are also a prime reason for this version's unfair difficulty, though it depends on the zone. Hiyoko Master, Mecha Sonic and the Motor Boar are relatively the same, save for a smaller battle arena. The seal now inches towards you after you hit it to try and whip you with its tail, though that only makes the battle last longer. As the Sumo Pig is actually a little more fun to fight due to its more unpredictable attack pattern, the only boss where the added difficulty is a plus. And then there's the first boss of the game, the hardest one by far. The fight is already fairly tricky, with the main hazard being the slippery slope and the cannonballs bouncing around, but now they hop at two different heights, one of which flies off screen while giving you little reaction time, and there's no rings in Act 3, so you basically have to do a perfect no-hit run. You only start the game with 3 lives, so if you haven't lost any in the cramped obstacle courses beforehand, then that gives you only 3 tries to make it past this fricking boss. Truly an unfair difficulty spike. And the final boss, goodness me, the mech and the pipes barely squeeze itself into the tight screen before, still having the benefit of seeing where the tube exits are and where to hit Robotnik. In the Game Gear version, you go all over the place at nauseating velocity, camera in tow, with barely a chance to see the hazards coming your way. It's challenging as heck, but in a really unfair manner. Like, this final confrontation didn't need to be designed this way. Certain music tracks were also switched around or added, possibly as a correction to the tone they were trying to give off. For instance, the intro cutscene is extended somewhat and has the ominous Scrambled Egg Zone track playing, with the old intro music moved to the previously silent title screen. The boss theme is completely rearranged into a more ominous tune, almost harkening back to the one from the first Sonic game due to how abruptly it plays. I quite enjoy it. The good ending has its own music in this version to counterbalance how depressing it sounded for both endings in the original. It's delightfully chipper and full of life, but it isn't quite as effectual as the sobriety of the other one. Still a good bop. Other minor changes include slight colour alterations and the water level rising in Act 2 of Aqua Lake Zone to give the players a moment of mercy, and any monitors containing the temporary speed boost power-up are missing and replaced with regular ring boxes. Probably for the best, if we're being honest. Running fast in this version is more punishing than my digestive system. The Game Gear version is very much the more difficult version of the two releases, and was sadly the one that caught the most attention with re-release after re-release. But what did the fans think of it though? And is it regarded well in the modern day? There are some qualities that help Sonic 8-bit stand out and be acknowledged by the fanbase. The music is widely considered to be one of the best in the whole console, with Sonic 8-bit being the only other one that gets as much praise for its tracks. The events of Sonic 2 were adapted by Archie Comics following the reboot to make the game events canon to the main story. Used as a framing device for several issues in flashback form, this adaptation of the story had Breezy and the quirky mini-boss squad from the Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog cartoon, love these guys, and followed up immediately with the events of a later Game Gear title, Tails' Sky Patrol. Some of the badniks and bosses were given more official sounding names as well, including Egg Antlion for the first boss, Silver Sonic because that's just what it was called back then, and the Egg Storm Chamber for the final boss. I accept these as canon. In terms of fan-made content, there has been two notable projects. One of these is Sonic the Hedgehog 2 Rescue Tails, a slight reimagining of the game with a whole 16-bit overhaul. This fan recreation, made by Leica Dreamer, remakes the first 4 zones of the game, complete with a remixed soundtrack and even a couple of new tracks that I honestly quite enjoy. Reimagined as taking place exactly after Sonic 2 for the Genesis, where the Death Egg blew up and the heroic duo pieced out of there, this time around it starts with Tails being kidnapped in Emerald Hill Zone before the game begins proper in Underground Zone. The levels are the same as before, but extended and rearranged for a more traditional level length, with the new art giving much added depth in the background. Sonic can utilise the super peel out and drop dash moves, always a fun feature, even if it bugs out often and the level design still punishes reckless speeding. The enemies, while extremely numerous, look fine in their upscaling from simple 8-bit sprites, and the Chaos Emeralds are much easier to find. It keeps up in the challenge department with its constant traps and hazards around every turn, most predominantly spikes, really honouring the original game's steep difficulty, eh? The bosses are the same, regardless of the graphical change, with the addition of a hit bar and the omission of the sumo pig, and are fought at the end of Act 2 and thankfully give the player a ring so they don't have to sweat buckets just to get past Stage 1. It's got more than a couple of haphazardly placed obstacles and isn't the most polished fan game, but it's still mighty impressive in what it sets out to do. Looking forward to the full game, buddy. Put me in it. The other one worth mentioning is by Creative Araya, Sonic SMS Remake 2. I brought up their recreation of Sonic 1 8-bit in a previous video, and honestly, I didn't give them enough credit. These remakes are pretty freaking sweet, and you can play as multiple characters in them. Not only are the colour palettes altered and the shading more relaxed now that they aren't limited by the hardware, but the games are much more fun to play compared to their originals, at least in my eyes. My only issue is the use of fading and transparency with the game's assets and screen transitions, which take me out of it a tad. Eggman does not vanish like a boo. Sonic 2's remake by Araya is notable in being a complete reworking of the game's core features, making it more of a fan reimagining really. Instead of rescuing Tails as Sonic, it's a duo of characters getting the Master Emerald back from Robotnik's clutches, and the two-player characters can be switched between each other at any point of the adventure, whether it's to fly over gaps in the reorganised levels, or use things like the hang gliders, which are much less punishing to use. The title cards have been redesigned to use the characters' sprites of how they appear in-game, animals actually fly out of destroyed badniks. The music compositions are a curious combination of 8-bit and 16-bit instruments, and they are not too bad, and you can even toggle between them or the originals. Elemental shields appear and are well utilised, and thanks to widescreen support, levels and bosses are no longer a constant brush with death. There's even optional modes like Time Attack, Encore from Sonic Mania, 2-player competition through local Wi-Fi, boss rush, and more. Other adaptation-based changes include a freezing mechanic in Aqua Lake Zone's Act 1, where you periodically end up immobilized for a second and have to make sure you're not in an inconvenient area. They also add shields, checkpoints, and even consistent air bubbles in Aqua Lake Zone Act 2. Thank you. Why is it wasn't even the original? Special stages appear, using the same music and aesthetic as Sonic 1 8-bits, and collecting all Chaos Emeralds from them allows you to achieve a super form. The implementation of Oil Ocean Zone from the Genesis version has a neat oil board segment for Act 1, and has a fight against the Bead Worm from Sonic Chaos. Scrambled Egg Zone also has a sudden drill segment in Act 3, Sonic is drilling, and Crystal Egg Zone has a wholly different music track and level layout, and doesn't require all Chaos Emeralds to reach it. It also uses the Pig Sumo boss with extra moves due to Green Hills Zone being replaced. That replacement level ends up as Time Hill Zone following that, basically a playable version of the game's ending cutscene from the original. Act 1 uses Green Hills Zone's music track and has the colour palettes constantly fade through the different times of day. Act 2 is an auto-scroll section atop the tornado, akin to Sky Chase Zone, and making Sonic 2 look more like Sonic 2. And Act 3 has a whole different boss fight in an arena akin to the original game's final battle. Speaking of final battles, there's an extra one if you collect all Chaos Emeralds, where you chase Robotnik in his big arm mech as Super Sonic, avoiding missiles and simulations of meteors. Also, Sonic and Tails can achieve hyper forms in this game? And there's an extras zone, but you'll have to play the game to find out. I'm not going to spoil the entire game. And if it's too easy, there's Panic Egg Mode, where there are no checkpoints or rings. I really enjoy this fan-made version. It's practically suited for fans of all types of playstyles. If it wasn't so vastly different in its mechanics and story, I'd easily say it was the definitive version of the game. It also says a lot about the original game that the most fun you can have with Sonic 2 8-bit, unless you're someone who enjoys high difficulty only found in vintage video games like these, is with fan remakes that give you an entirely different experience than the 1992 release. Sonic 2 8-bit was a game praised for its hardness and sense of challenge on launch, and while games are no longer arbitrarily difficult or eat up quarters like at an arcade, this game still has its fans in the hardcore gamer crowd. For the average Sonic fan, to a casual player, hell, even those who are familiar with the Hedgehog's classic catalogue, this game is not really worth playing. Unless you can get past the relentless difficulty spikes, shoddily implemented level gimmicks and control changes, and the checkpoint-starved zones and ringless boss acts that knock you out after one minor mistake, there's a game here somewhere you might enjoy. I just feel there are way better, way more forgiving Sonic titles to play on the Game Gear. Sonic 2 8-bit is barely acknowledged by the company that published it. I'll just say there's a reason why Sonic 2 for the Genesis is considered Tails' proper introduction to the series. It is certainly a E rank. Not very fun to play or remarkable, but not the worst Sonic game ever made, that's for sure. It's got a 2 in its title, but it may as well be considered 8-bit's Sonic 0. Well, there was a whole lot of ranting there. I'm not quite used to doing that, and I do hope it didn't put anyone off. Anywho, stay tuned for the next video where I will be looking at Sonic CD for the SEGA CD. Thank you ever so much for watching, if indeed you still are, and I'll see you in the next video. Wow.